Welcome, everyone. Good day. My name is Adenike Huggins. I'm Senior Director, Education Policy and Advocacy, and welcome to this month's Education and Youth Development webinar series. Today's webinar is entitled Chronic Absenteeism, What is the Role of Educational Spaces? I'm so pleased to be joined by our panelists, Dr. Sarah Ledoff, Dr. Jeremy Singer, and Reverend Larry Simmons. As you all know, after this webinar, we're going to take a little bit of a break over the rest of the spring and the summer, and we will resume in September. All of the recordings for the webinars we've done so far are located on a dedicated playlist on the National Urban League's YouTube page. I'll be sharing that out with all of the meeting registrants, and once today's recording has been uploaded. So over the coming months, you'll still be able to replay and enjoy and relive the webinars that have taken place so far. So this topic is really near and dear, I think, probably to all of us in the education and youth development space. I really think that over the course of the not the webinar, of the pandemic, we saw how widespread uh, absenteeism, chronic absenteeism, um, poor attendance, poor engagement could really be amplified as we were dealing with a health crisis, a racial crisis in this country, and so many young people, to put it in many districts, language just disappeared. They could not find their students. And even now that we have perhaps recovered from the pandemic, at least economically, there are many districts that are still under enrolled. They have not gotten back to their pre-pandemic enrollment numbers. And so I think today's conversation is very timely, and we really want to be solution oriented. And so I think all of us, again, who have a vested interest in our youth development and youth facing work will find this topic interesting. And I'm hoping that we can encourage some robust discussion as we discuss chronic absenteeism and all of the work that these entities, as well as yourselves, have been doing in this space. I never miss an opportunity to shamelessly plug the work that we do here at the National Urban League. And during the pandemic, we actually did a film series called Broadening Emerging Voices from the Pandemic, Students Speak Out, where we spoke to young people who had become disconnected from formal education during the pandemic. We had a peer-to-peer model where we had other young people interview them to learn about why they had become disconnected. And then the young people provided recommendations both to administrators and teachers, but also to their similarly situated peers who might be feeling the same way. And so while that happened during the pandemic, I still think the lessons that we learned from the young people are important. And I will continue to evangelize and socialize and share that. So if you take a look at the chat, you'll see the link to our webinar, to our film series, again entitled Emerging Voices from the Pandemic, Students Speak Out. So without further ado, I am pleased again to welcome our three panelists for today's conversation. I'll put their full bios in the chat, but again, introducing Dr. Sarah Lenoff. She is the Leonard Kaplan Endowed Professor and Associate Professor of Education Leadership and Policy Studies at Wayne State University. We also have Dr. Jeremy Singer, who is a research faculty member in the College of Education, also at Wayne State University. And we have Reverend Simmons, um, who is a recipient of several awards, um, and was selected by the Skillman Foundation as one of 10 visionary leaders in 2024 in Detroit. Uh, so just to get us started, I have a question for all panelists. Can you all talk about how you began working together? So Doctors Lenoff and Singer, you're both faculty researchers at Wayne State, while Reverend Simmons, you are the co-founder of Every School Day Counts, the Detroit Coalition. How did this collaborative work begin, and why are partnerships like this one beneficial for addressing a complex issue like chronic absenteeism?
Sarah, you want to kick us off?
I think you should, Rev. You started the work before we got involved, so why don't you start there and
It's
we
my
can.
fault, huh? I should say, by the way, of introduction, I'm a Urban League alumni. I was a vice president in the Detroit Urban League for 5 years, from way back 78 to 83. So um, one of the family.
Well, we like to say once an urban leaguer, always an urban leaguer.
Yes,
So
we say
welcome back, welcome home.
thank you, thank you. So back in 2012, 2011, there was a group called the Excellent Schools Detroit Coalition that was trying to address the quality of education in Detroit. And they reached out to me and others in Brightmoor, which is the community where I was pastoring at the time. I've since retired, but still active there. And asked the question, what can we do that would improve education? Coincidentally, the Pastors Alliance in Brightmoor had just had a meeting and said that there was a really serious problem about children not being in school. And so I offered up to the group that had convened that we should do something about absenteeism, about truancy. We did not have the language of chronic absence at that point. The group agreed, and so we began to organize churches and community folk around this idea of helping students get to school. To show you just how naive we were, we thought that if we got together with all of our cars and our school buses, that we could get all the kids who were chronically absent, not chronically absent, who were suffering truancy, we could drive them to school. We just drive around, pick them up, and take them to school. Uh, I think it was 3 cars later, and among them being mine, that we had burned out. We realized, particularly after doing some research, that this problem was way larger than a few church buses and eager volunteers could solve. And this group broke off into what became Every School Day Counts Detroit, and began reaching out to try to understand exactly what was this tiger we had grabbed by the tail. Coincidentally, or at the same time, in Southwest Detroit, a very similar effort had begun, separate from what we were doing in Brightmoor. And 2 of the leaders in Every School Day Counts, I'm sorry, in Excellent Schools Detroit, brought us together to form Every School Day Counts Detroit. And Jamila Martin and Molly Sweeney, these 2 really, really dynamic young women. Um, and that's how we began to meet. And it was during the course of these meetings and these different things that we were trying that we had the good fortune of being joined by none other than the good doctors. And they came alongside us, with us, and began to learn, and we began to teach one another about this thing and discovered the notion or the idea of chronic absenteeism. That's a really short version for about a 3-year period.
Yeah, and I'll just add a little bit to that, which is, yeah, I think it was in some ways serendipity that, chronic absence, when I first started at Wayne State, it was 2015, the Every School Day, or the Every Student Succeeds Act had recently passed, which sort of put the term chronic absence on the radar of schools because it was showing up in state accountability systems. So suddenly, the state school districts were starting to pay attention to this new metric of kind of missing 10% or more days. And so at the time, I was starting to do research with the local public school district, Detroit Public Schools community. It was actually Detroit Public Schools at the time. They had some of the highest rates of chronic absence in the country with, kind of the first national numbers out there. And I was working with them to try to identify what was going on, why so many students were missing so much school. And that kind of happened at the same time that Rev and his group were getting going. So we sort of joined forces and to answer your question, why was this important? I think it was really valuable, in part because there were and frankly still are a lot of kind of working theories about why so many students miss so much school, what it's going to take to get them to school. But at the time, especially, and even still today, relatively thin evidence about what actually works and what the kind of, at the time, what the key reasons were. And so I think partnering around research around and really around learning, I think we had a learning kind of orientation to the problem, helped us to kind of unpack some of our assumptions and some of the early work that we did really, I think, undermined some of the kind of working assumptions that we all had about what was happening.
Let me pick up on that as we talk about solutions, because you know how people talk about stages of grief? They're like stages of chronic absenteeism awareness. And the first stage is you become aware of it, which usually leads you to being appalled, because it's so much more prevalent than we would have thought that it was. Uh, the next stage is, well, getting to school is something parents can solve. So let's do things with parents. Our first effort in that next stage of awareness was to have a huge public awareness campaign called 2 Days is Too Many. And we put up on social media everywhere. We bought a couple of billboards. We put stuff online to tell parents that if their children were absent 2 days a month, they would be chronically absent, and chronic absence would lead to serious consequences for their future. And I remember one lady, I tell this story all the time. One lady at one of our focus groups, after we had started this campaign, stopped me in mid-sentence and said, "Don't you think I know my child has to be in school?" I mean, she was outraged. And she made clear to me the reason her child, because this was a focus group made up of parents of children chronically absent, that the contributing factors towards her child being absent from school had to do with her work and the time she had to be there and the time her children could get in school. And it created a conflict that she could not resolve. And this was my first hint that what we were dealing with was more than just the parents. The next step is usually the school. The school needs to fix this. The school needs to do something. That leads to the third, am I at the third or the fourth? The fourth stage, which is let's give incentives. Let's pay the kids. Let's reward the kids. Let's cite the kids. Let's pass out certificates to the kids. Let's whatever you think fills in the blank for what the school should do. And none of these work. Now, Sarah can tell you more about the research, but I'm going to tell you from our anecdotal experience. None of them work. And really, if we stop and think, how could incentives work? Who can afford to keep that up? Um, so I think it's really important to show how her research, not just her, it was her team, of which, of course, Dr. J is a big part. Her team helped us to realize that this was not a school problem, but a community problem, more specifically, a system problem.
And Jeremy, did you want to weigh in on this question? Thank you, Rev.
Thanks. No, I think the two of them got it covered, especially Rev beautifully there at the end. So we can keep going.
All right. So, well, Jeremy, I'm going to bring you in for this question. You and Dr. Lenoff have both released a book, Rethinking Chronic Absenteeism. What is it about chronic absenteeism that you believe the educational spaces need to rethink? And what should educational organizations be considering as they work to address this issue?
Well, I can start, and then Sarah, please pick up for me. And I think where we can start is right where Larry left off, which is basically that kind of phase that he described, the sort of shift to focusing on schools. That's kind of where we're at as a nation, and it's where we've been for a while. But I think it's especially solidified in the context of increased absenteeism rates since the pandemic. There's a bigger push for schools to figure out what to do to solve this problem. And the bottom line from our book is that, of course, there are things that schools can and should be doing, but that we can't only think about this as a school solution. It's, of course, a school-based problem because it's about getting to and from school, but it's not only something that can be solved by schools. So, yeah, I mean, educational spaces, there's a lot to do in educational spaces. There's a lot to do if you are someone who runs an educational space, schools, of course, and others. But yeah, I think if there's one thing we hope people take away is that we believe that to truly solve this issue in places like Detroit, of course, where absenteeism rates are really high, but truly across the nation, we need to be focused on a broader set of policy domains, not just education, but housing, transportation, healthcare, employment, and family economics, and all the sorts.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in and say I think one thing that we learned in Detroit, which really focused on kind of a school-based solution, right? Even the work that the coalition that Rev and Christine were leading, Every School Day Counts Detroit, a lot of their work was trying to push into schools, trying to get schools to behave differently, engage with families differently, develop programming for students within schools. And so we spent a lot of time, almost a decade now, kind of studying those efforts within schools. And I think one big takeaway for us is that the kind of toolbox that schools have available to them and the resources they have available to them and the staff and the time are not all that well aligned to the needs of students and families facing chronic absence. So, we discuss this in our book, but school staff are, for instance, really well trained to use data in their decision making. And so that was a big emphasis of both the coalition's work and the schools that we were observing and doing our research in. They were trying to use kind of rates of chronic absence to organize students and help them kind of strategize about what to do about student attendance. Well, that approach works really well in other kinds of educational contexts like teaching and learning, like even discipline, and some other issues. For attendance, it's less helpful because the number of days that students miss has very little to do with kind of the underlying reasons why students are missing. And so kind of trying to adopt a strategy where, every child who's missing 30 days is getting this sort of intervention is, maybe likely to help a handful of students for whom that intervention is kind of well aligned with their problem. But not likely to help the, maybe hundreds of other students who are facing, chronic health issues, maybe a transportation problem, a childcare issue at home, etc. So, our book really is that kind of a call to action for both school folks to kind of rethink the way they're going about addressing chronic absence, and also like a call in to other agencies, other organizations, and people who can improve the conditions for student attendance outside of schools, and in some ways kind of take the burden off of schools for solving these kind of root causes that we think are really outside the scope of their influence.
You know, I really want to emphasize this different way of thinking. And so maybe I'm being too grandiose, but if you think about Pasteur and the germ theory, before the germ theory was popular, there was this theory called miasma, that the disease was spread by the air. And it took a long time once Pasteur had put forward this theory of germs, microorganisms, before it was generally accepted. But once this new way of thinking was adopted, it led to an explosion of understanding about how human beings get sick. Because people's perspective changed, they looked for different causes. I think the great thing about Sarah and Jeremy's work is that there's a thing buried in their book that nobody talks about but me. They don't even talk about it, called the supplemental framework. If you think of the ways that, of children being absent from school has evolved, there was the standard when we got started 14 years ago or 12 years ago of average daily attendance, which was a kind of group measure of the school. Or maybe it would get down to the classroom, but generally it was a measure of the school. How many students are absent on average every day? That measure determined whether or not they were doing a good job. I don't need to take you all through the revolutionary way chronic absence shifted the way we think. So it went from the school to students individually. How do groups of students attend school and their rate of attendance, and how does that impact education? Well, the supplemental framework, which you'll find in their book, this is a shameless promotion, um, but you'll find in their book, I'm not sure where it is in the book. I read the book before it came out because they were talking about me real bad. They wanted me not to sue them. No, that's not true. I'm lying. Uh, in the supplemental framework, they actually dig into the patterns of chronic absence to show that a student, let's say, who's absent every Monday for 39 weeks is different than a student who's absent 20 times in a 1 month period. And the intervention necessary to help that student is different. This supplemental framework, again, is a shift in the way we think. So let me answer your question about what can schools do. They need to shift the way they think about this problem and reach outside the school and find allies and supporters in the private sector, in the clergy community, in the community itself, and begin to talk about a holistic community-wide response and how we can adapt ourselves to solving this problem. Changing the way we think is key to solving this, and bringing new people, or not, maybe not new, other people to the question of this educational crisis is key.
I'll just
Thank you.
add that. Oh,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead. I'm sorry.
No, no,
Oh,
no, I
I
was
was
just
just
gonna thank the Reverend.
okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't want to stop you from thanking him, but I just wanted to add, we know that a lot of what we are speaking to and what we're recommending, if you're an educator, because I know there are some educators here, you might be hearing that and you might be thinking like, that's all well and good, but I have a school and I have students right now, and what am I supposed to do? So I want to reassure anyone who's thinking in that way that, yeah, to Rev's point, we have a lot of recommendations for how schools can think about the issue, and in the meantime, as we work towards the medium and longer term goal of involving a lot more people from a lot of different segments of our policymaking and organizations and parts of our society in the issue, what are some of the things you should be prioritizing? So we can speak a little bit more specifically to those if that would be helpful, but I just want to make sure to plug that.
Yes, I think that that's a great distinction to make. And I did want to also point out that, we didn't say schools, we said educational spaces. And we were intentional about that because here at the Urban League, we believe that education takes place everywhere. It takes place within the confines of a school building. It takes place within community, houses of worship, in the out of school time space. And so this is really a call to action for all youth-facing roles. So we're not just, saying that all of the onus and the responsibility should be on the school, because we understand that learning and education, socialization, development really takes place in so many other places. And we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge that. I know we have a contingent of our colleagues here who are part of Project Ready, which is our signature program that focuses on college and career access and success. And so, that's also an educational space. In the age of AI, we have all of these tools and platforms, resources that attempt to take information that is provided, large data sets, and to predict young people who might be at risk for certain certain challenges like chronic absenteeism, or based on markers like social economic status, which we know is typically the free and reduced price lunch is a proxy for that. But I want to talk more, because I think that what you all are really discussing is a holistic approach. It's very intentional, and it requires the collaboration of many different actors, many different stakeholders. Now, there are certain programs and platforms that may promise to solve the problem of chronic absenteeism, and I'd love to get your take on your familiarity with any of these, and just sort of what you're thinking. Because I think that sometimes districts may opt to pay for such a platform or a program rather than actually do the work of building community and really engaging stakeholders. So, and I'm not pointing out this one in particular, just that it was brought to my attention recently. So yeah, we know that schools are looking at tools, strategies to address chronic absenteeism, like a platform that I just learned about recently called Knowledge, which incentivizes students with attendance awards and sort of almost gamifies the school experience. Given your work addressing chronic absenteeism, how effective are approaches such as these, and what, if anything, would you suggest schools and educational organizations do instead? And Rev, I know you were talking about the incentives, because here in New York City, we had a pilot program with Dr. Roland Fryer from Harvard, I think, some years ago. So yeah, we know that it's definitely not something that's going to last. There was a lot of debate around the merits of doing something like that in the first place. But now we see this sort of AI-driven platform that gamifies the attendance or the educational experience for young people. What do you think about things like this? Is this sort of like a short-term solution? Is it a solution at all? Is it a perversion of what we should be doing? I'd love to get your take on this.
I think we all have thoughts about this. Maybe I'll jump in first, and I know Rev and Jeremy can add to this. So one thing that's true is that we do not have a lot of great evidence about what really works to improve attendance. There is some empirical work on things like rewards and incentives, and the evidence is very mixed. So what I mean by that is that there's some evidence that there's a very slight positive effect, and there's some evidence that it can actually have a negative effect in the long term on student attendance. The theory being that it's kind of replacing an intrinsically motivated behavior with an extrinsic motivation, tool that is not sustainable and maybe isn't all that attractive to students. And so in the long term, and so over time can kind of erode that maybe intrinsic motivation that we want to see. I think, our rationalization for why any of these sort of what I would think of as like relatively low cost kind of incentives or communication strategies, and why they're not seeing a big effect is that they're really targeting the idea that students are missing a lot of school because they are not motivated to get there, right? So that they want, that they don't want to go there, that they can get there, but they just are not showing up. And kind of this idea of skipping or something, right? Or that parents are doing the same thing. And, certainly there's some students and some families for whom that's true, but our research and the research of lots of other people have documented that that is just not the case for the vast majority of families. And so, those sorts of strategies are just unlikely to work at scale because they're not aligned with the kind of root causes for why students are missing. So I think, my we have seen, I mean, schools really like incentives, right? Again, it's aligned with the kind of things that they do for other reasons, right? For kind of positive school climate, for encouraging, students to read a bunch of books in 1 month, for instance, that kind of thing. Um, but that it can actually suck the energy out of other initiatives that might have more of a long-term kind of sustainable impact on student attendance. And it can kind of distract from some of these core reasons why kids are missing. So I would caution districts and schools on going all in on those types of things, especially if they come with kind of a bigger price tag, because they're unlikely to have much of a difference.
So, I'm sure nobody here knows anything about what I'm about to say, but one of the things that happens with drug use is that it never feels as good as the first time you use the drug. Incentives are very much the same way. The first time you do it in the school, it's a big deal. But round about the second, third, fourth, fifth time students are exposed to this, they're like, oh, that's the best you got? And it's not just students. This is human behavior. We adapt to these artificial uh, motivators, these things that generate the dopamine in us. But I didn't mention this in my stages of chronic absenteeism grief, but the other side of incentives is punishment, because they're both focused on altering the behavior of the student on the premise that it's a behavior of volition, that the student and or the parent can choose to behave differently, and that there are not other more substantial barriers in their life that's keeping them from there. So if we punish them enough, if we take them off of any kind of welfare or state support, if we threaten or put them in jail, that's the underside of incentives. It's a disincentive. It's a negative incentive. It doesn't work either. The reason I keep going back to the systemic question. Let's take the lady who stood up at our focus group. There are 4,000 churches in Detroit. Actually, I understand now there's 5,000, but there are 4,000 churches in Detroit. There is a church within a block of every school in the city of Detroit. There's one right across the street from the church. Actually, there's 7 in the block, but 7 churches, one church right across the street. Suppose the church partnered with the school and offered an early breakfast program for the mother to be able to drop her kid off. Do all of the things you need to do. Let's see if that'll work for all those parents who are having trouble because of work hours. Let's see if we can engage these resources that are right here already, heated and cooled 24/7 all year, and engage them in this work. Has anybody ever actually asked employers if they would create an early child care center on site so parents don't have to run 5 places in the morning or in the evening before they come to work? I don't know that these would happen, But until we stop looking at the air as the source of the problem and realize germs are what we're fighting, we'll never know what will cure the disease. And I would say this about systems. How many people here ever saw a charging station in 2012? Probably nobody. There were 5,000 of them in the entire United States. Do you know how many there are today? There's all, depending on whose source you look at, there's more than 68,000 of them, and they're doubling every 2 years. That's a systemic response to a question. How do we separate from gasoline as a propellant for our vehicles? That's a system, broad, scaled up investment in a solution. That's what we need for chronic absence. The children who we are allowing to have barriers block them from school are the very children who inside their minds have the solutions to the problems that society has, but it's locked away in their lack of access or participation in education. I, I, I know everybody wants to know what's the solution. What can I do tomorrow when I go into school? And that's how we wind up with the incentive programs. But I'm going to tell you, I've been at this for 12 years. If you find the tomorrow solution, please call me and let me know, because we're going to do it. There is none. The reason my son is an educator. I've talked to people all over the country who came to school with me, younger people who are working this. Nobody has a solution because everybody's trying to solve the problem in the school. It's only measured in the school. It comes from outside the school.
Can I quickly just say, because you mentioned at the beginning of your question about technology and tech tools, I think it does make sense to adopt some of these tools to improve some of the efficiency of the systems or the strategies that you might be using. Again, I know we're not only talking about schools, but school systems might be the systems that are large enough that it might make sense to adopt technology at a scale like that compared to a smaller, community-based program. But the tools aren't really substitutes for the core things that matter the most in educational spaces. So they might help you do these things more efficiently, like identify students who you should be focusing on, collecting information from them about what challenges they're facing. But really it comes down to the fundamentals that we know matter, and that any educational space is already focused on a positive relationship with students and their families, a positive climate and culture and experience for the students there, engaging experience, whether it's academic or otherwise in that educational space. Those are already the things that we knew mattered. And so as insofar as tools kind of help you do those things better, I think that makes sense, but we shouldn't expect them to be silver bullets and solve the problem, especially because as we've already talked about, even those efforts are only going to get you so far without focusing more broadly on the root causes of the issue.
We should probably talk about how big the problem is in Detroit, because that might help people understand why we're so focused on this. I don't know what the current number is. When we were really beginning to get active, our chronic absence rate exceeded 60%, if I'm recalling correctly. That means 6 out of every 10 students was chronically absent, completely disrupting the educational process. Even now, but 5 years after the pandemic, I think we're still in the mid-60s. We dropped from the 70s back into the 60s. Those are huge numbers. I mean, we're talking 800,000 school-age children in Detroit, round numbers.
80,000, you mean? Yeah.
Yes, I'm saying, yeah, correct. Because there are not 800,000 people in the city. So when you start talking about a problem of this scale, it's great to have our anecdotes. The student we talked to or who was greeted at the door by a caring adult and whose success in school changed. I love those programs. I've been part of them. I've been one of those caring adults. It's great to have programs where the transportation is supplemented by really caring church folk or other volunteers who drive around to the homes of students and transport them to work, I mean, to school. But at this scale, we have to speak about scale and really lift up the larger vision. I think the great thing I think about a conversation like this for me is that it allows us to have that conversation without the pressure that schools are under to make something to solve the problem before school lets out in May or June, because it won't be. And it won't be solved next September. It's going to take us some years, but the longer we wait to tackle this at scale, which means getting everybody who's willing to come to the table, the longer it's going to take to solve it. And the more we lose in the brilliance and the creative energy of our students.
Right now, talking about the brilliance and creative energy, obviously we know that this work is challenging. It can be complex as well. And you know, Reverend Simmons, I think talking about the actual numbers maybe depresses us a little bit because it seems it's a lot, right? I mean,
A
it's
lot.
definitely a lot, and we're talking about a crisis. And um, but what are some of the bright spots that you all have seen and experienced related to addressing chronic absenteeism? Any success stories that you might want to point out or promising strategies and tools that you'd
Mhm.
like to share before we open it up to the audience?
I'd like to start on this one. I want to highlight two initiatives in three different places that I think are worth attention. But the main thing about them is that they're intensive and they involve a lot of money or a lot of external partners. So they're not the kind of thing that you can just do right away. But in New York City, and in a few different places in California, there's been some really great research on the community schools model and evidence that the community schools model, which integrates services and service providers and community-based organizations into the school. We've seen some strong, promising evidence on how that can improve attendance. There's some research on that, and those are just two places where it's been implemented in a kind of high-profile way. And then Connecticut, the state of Connecticut, did a really cool pilot program that they're continuing that involved sort of intensive home visits. So there were a few different ways it was carried out, but usually the best way was someone who was already working for a school system, and they would be assigned a small caseload. So maybe 20 families, but sometimes as small as only 4 or 5 families. And they would basically go and try and forge a strong relationship and figure out what's going on and problem solve with them. Um, that program also showed pretty strong results. That they piloted that kind of shortly after the onset of the pandemic, I think probably in 2021-22 school year. Um, that's the thing that program offers that a lot of stuff that we often see schools and other educational organizations doing is that was a very intensive investment. And it was very focused on a reasonable caseload and strong relationship forming and problem solving with families. So I think those represent some of the ingredients of the kinds of solutions that we would want to start seeing, right? Bringing together resources, investing at in terms of a reasonable capacity for any person or any group of people to be working with families and investing in like that sort of deep relational work. I think those are some of the ingredients that I'd like to look towards in terms of what we should be focusing on. But just want to acknowledge it's not cheap. These aren't things, there's other little things that make sense for schools or other educational organizations to be doing that they might be able to do today. But we just know that those aren't necessarily things that are going to have a big impact like these other things that take more of an investment.
I would say, by the way, charging stations are not cheap either.
Yeah.
So, I'm never going to allow people to say it costs too much money. After what, I mean, 68,000 and doubling every 2 years. No, we do what we want to do, and we do it big when we want to. I would say our pivot in the Brightmore Alliance has been to talk about a holistic solution around households. So we've kind of targeted households that have children in early life between the ages of 0 and 3, and to work with other partners in the neighborhood to wrap around the families and to support them around a goal of success, not just school success, but life success, life prospering. I don't know if it's going to work because we're just getting started at it. But what we're hoping to, the point we hope to be able to make is that what we are doing in microcosm in these 100, we have 100 households that are engaged so far, 105 actually, is to show in these 105 households that there is a rate of success with them that can be replicated, that can go to scale using the investment we already have. We're trying to make the case that the after-school programs we already have are great for school-age children, that the early childhood centers that we have and the thing we call six-a-days inside the household are great things that parents can do, that parents can plug into some of the workforce development stuff that we have as part of our partnerships um, that can help families elevate their level of income. And we know that as your resources grow, the barriers to your children getting to school drop. And to the degree that mothers in particular, I don't know why fathers don't get no dap in this, but for mothers in particular, when mothers are seen by their children as studying and going to school, it's a high correlation between that and the children succeeding at school. I'll let the researchers unravel that one. I have no idea why. But my point is, we can't scale the Brightmore Alliance and our few allies can't scale this citywide. But what we can do is scale up in a school, scale up in a neighborhood, and to the degree that we meet barriers to organize public policy changes that will facilitate the ease with which others can engage like this. Um, this problem, so the community schools and doing this household 3-generation engagement are the things that we have seen other places be successful, and we think they're going to be here. You heard Sarah mention, Dr. Linhoff mention um, that illness, particularly asthma, is a challenge in Detroit. Um, Investing in one health professional present in the school has tremendous impact in lowering absenteeism related to illness. Uh, it's, I mean, it costs some money, but it's not, $1 million a nurse. It's not, so we think by looking for the microorganisms that cause the disease, that we can begin to develop cures by shifting our thinking and changing our doing.
I know I want to get to Q&A, so I won't take too long, but I do think that there's a lot of opportunity for innovation in this space for, I would say yes to some of these, bigger costs, more systemic solutions, but in the meantime, I do think there's ways that schools can be more creative in really aligning what they're doing with what they're hearing from families are the reasons why kids are missing. So, we talk all the time in Detroit, transportation is a major barrier here. We have really weak public transit. We don't have school-based transit for about half the students in Detroit. And so, this is an area it's a systemic problem. We really need a system-wide solution. But in the meantime, can schools help PTAs organize phone trees so that parents have a backup ride when their car breaks down or where they don't have gas money or when they have a work conflict, right? low cost, may not solve everything, but it could, could make the difference for many families who just, need that extra kind of backup support. So those are the kinds of ideas that I would really suggest kind of, like brainstorming and thinking together with your school community, and it's going to be unique for each school, depending on what barriers they're facing.
Thank you. And so now I have a question for the audience, before I invite the audience to ask you all questions. Um, I'd love to hear from some of our affiliates, our Urban League affiliates, about what they're doing to address chronic absenteeism, um, as an educational space within communities, and how you all, our Urban League affiliates, how you might be thinking about that work in light of today's discussion.
Is that the sound of crickets?
No, that's the sound of somebody like trying to get to their unmute button. So,
Oh,
yeah. So we typically take, a few more seconds, get to that uncomfortable pause, and then, because it takes a little bit longer to get
takes a
to
minute.
unmute. So,
Feel you.
and I'm happy because I see so many of my colleagues here. I'm happy to put one of them on the spot.
Adenike, can you repeat the question for me, please?
Oh, you see, look at that, Achilles. I feel like we're simpatico because I was absolutely thinking about you. The question was, how, what, if anything, are you doing to address chronic absenteeism, and how are you thinking about that work in light of today's discussion?
Um, so we've kind of have like a band-aid solution, I think. And my coworker Angela is also on the call, and she works with a different set of youth, who are also having this challenge. For us, it's really about parent engagement, and so we've been working through our Project Ready program, to engage parents a little bit better around attendance. We have students that are amazing. They're very intelligent. When they get to school, they have no problem getting merit roll and high honor roll. It's about getting to class. And so we're seeing every year students struggling because they'll have like, I don't know, like something like 50 absences in their first period. But then they'll end up eventually getting to class in the afternoon, and though it can be inconsistent, and so like that's the biggest thing we're seeing in it. Transportation is a big thing here in Lorain County, Ohio. It's non-existent. We have like this hybrid ride share program, um, that doesn't take people across the county. So someone living in the city of Lorain has to connect to another van in the city of Elyria, and it's just a logistical mess. And so what we do in our office outside of that is, if staff is able to, then we're trying to like be the middle of that. And so if we're able to take students to school, then we're doing that. We haven't quite come with like the best solution, other than being able to talk to parents, and help them to understand like that it should be a priority. And even if there's one car in the family, how are we scheduling the time that everybody's getting up and those things, because they use just the one car, as a crutch sometimes when we're having those conversations. And so really problem solving with them, um, has been a little bit of a challenge, just getting them to see why it's important. And because their students at the end of the day are kind of seeing the consequences. So like for our college tour that we hosted for a week, one of our students did not go because they did not have the grades, and that was largely due to their attendance. And so when we had a conversation with mom, she really couldn't understand. And so we had to really break it down. Like it impacts the whole family. It's not just The fact that you're not able to get them to school, like it's huge. So, yeah.
Thanks, Achilles. Appreciate your transparency there. And now I'd like to open it up to our broader audience to ask some questions of our presenters.
I'm James Patterson. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm a commissioner for the Rochester City School District. That's in upstate New York. And thanks a lot for allowing me to listen in. I learned a lot, which you give me ideas on to take back to our superintendent, relative to your ideas. So some of the things I heard, and I came on late, but community schools, I've been pushing for that to go back to true community schools. So we can work within those areas. And someone mentioned earlier, utilizing the churches, within those areas to go out maybe with a district leader, I thought, with a list of students that are chronically absent in that area. So that was one great thing that you mentioned. Again, the true community schools model, I'm definitely for that. And I'm just switching to my notes now. Someone said relative to having the parent groups, within our schools, communicate in an effort to share contact information and ride share. And someone mentioned a hybrid ride share program, more parent engagement, which I totally agree with. And that's about all I have in my notes because I came in late. But if you guys have any other ideas that you're going to put something out here that maybe on our notes that I might have missed, that I think this is very important for me, as a commissioner to be a part of this dialogue and take your ideas back to my superintendent. So thank you.
Thanks, James. That's heartening for us that you got something out of it. Jeremy dropped the link to our book and a discount code that any of you can use. The last chapter is really our recommendations, both for schools, but also for community organizations and for government agencies on what they can do to improve the conditions for student attendance. So encourage you to take a look at that. And if you can't, I think the book is on back order right now. So if you can't access it for a while, I'm happy to send those to you too. If you should, I'll put my email in the chat.
Yeah, I was going to just quickly mention more generally, feel free, I'll put my email as well. James, if when you talk to folks in the district and if they're your superintendent or someone else who'd want to have a conversation, we're always open to talking further about all the stuff, helping anyone we can. So
thank you. Appreciate it.
The one thing I would add to what you took away is I really would try to convene as broad a group of interested, disparate persons as you can to brainstorm this. Because our work began out of such sessions. It was different communities from different parts of Detroit. In Detroit, we have different kinds of governances for our schools, charters, traditional public, and parochial. We invited leadership from each one of those different governance models. We invited administrative personnel as well as, classroom and other personnel around the school and parents and youth. We didn't get as much youth because it was during the day, but we contributed to chronic absenteeism by bringing some anyway. But the point of this is it's in these kind of fertile gatherings that the ideas which are unique to your community will emerge. And I cannot emphasize enough, there are already people in your community, whatever that community is, who are concerned about this. And they're doing something. They're processing through the stages of chronic absence grief. They're trying stuff and getting frustrated because the work is not sustaining. I think gathering as many of them, issuing a call to that you're trying to put together a think tank made up of the community. Maybe you've got a chamber of commerce, so there may be chamber of commerce staff who can represent the business community, who are busy making money for their company, so they can't always come. But the chamber, this is kind of what the chamber does, or other business gatherings. Uh, Bring as many voices together as you can. And I'd really try to recruit private sector thinkers because they bring a perspective that those of us in the public sector don't always have and can help challenge some of our assumptions and bring new ways of thinking.
I I want to just quickly second that, and I should have mentioned earlier Rhode Island. I don't know that we have strong evidence yet, but I know Rhode Island is an example. It's a small state, and they convened a pretty broad set of stakeholders across a few different parts of their civic community. So I'll put a link in here, but I completely agree. Definitely the position that you're in as a commissioner to be able to bring people together from these other areas that need to be involved.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any additional questions for our panelists?
I guess the one thing I would add to all that's been said is, as we talk about these macro holistic solutions, there is nothing like relationship in terms of working with human beings. It's as true in therapy as it is in teaching, as it is in helping folks overcome the barriers. You may not be able to scale doing one-on-one work, but that's no reason for you not to do it. And I hope what we've talked about here today doesn't discourage you from doing one-on-one work. There is value in that. There's value in both. So I think all of us know how to do more than one thing at the same time. And we can do both of those. So I encourage you to continue to build the relationship with the students and the families, as well as you work on these macro system approaches.
Now, I have a quick question. So, I'm wondering which governess was the first to actually want to strategize with you and work to help decrease absenteeism? Because we've tried to work with different school districts and stuff like that, and sometimes you have to get through the political realm of things, because they're more like, let's stay inside, you know, type situation. So I was just curious as to how you were able to navigate and which governors actually started to work with
Hey,
you
Mr.
first.
Harris. Sure. Let me mute this.
For us, it wasn't the governance
I'm good.
as
I'm
much as
good.
it was
I
the
got a thing
relationship.
up here, but I'm not contributing to it at all. I'm just listening in.
And you're contributing, actually, because we just heard you.
I'm gonna find him and mute him. Just give me a moment.
Um, it was the relationships. We had already begun working with the schools through our various different, help organizations. And so as we grew in our knowledge, and really, I really want to emphasize that we didn't know all of this stuff when we got started. We learned this, and it was uh, the help of Wayne State and um, that helped us to learn. But we were researching this when we got lucky and got with the serendipitous help of Sarah and Jeremy and their peers. This your relationship with the school. The first people we got to the table were the building leaders where we had established relationships, because the building leaders are under enormous pressure to address this problem. We got from the building leader to somebody in central administration whom the building leader had a relationship with. and then they came to the table. And then that person, once they were bought in, usually got to the superintendent. And the superintendent either blessed it or said, I don't have time. But that was kind of the path that we got to the schools. Our relationship with either a teacher or a building leaders are really important. The principal or whatever it's called in your system, um, then connected us to the others in the system. Um, Less so, I think we had charters who were absolutely indifferent to what we were talking about. We had charters who were enthusiastic about what we were talking about. We had public schools that were enthusiastic. We had public schools who didn't care. In fact, they hated the chronic absence statistic because it said it made them look bad. That's a quote. The building leader said, "I'd rather use average daily attendance because my numbers are better." So that would be my, if you wanted to learn from our experience, take that relationship you have, talk about convening some thinkers, and have maybe not just one meeting, but plan on two or three as you grow your movement. We called ours the attendance movement in the beginning.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'll see if we have a final question before we wrap up today. Okay, so just to recap, I love the way that we ended talking about the power of relationships, because I will say that that was one of the recommendations that we heard from young people who participated in our film series, young people who had become disconnected from formal education during the pandemic. They talked about the lack of relationships and the fact that because when they moved to remote instruction, because they didn't have those strong, healthy developmental relationships, it was easier to just kind of disappear. And no one was checking for them, no one was checking on them. And so even the young people themselves recognize the value of having someone there, someone who cared and someone who would continue to make sure that their well-being was intact during the pandemic. Also, we also talked a bit about the community school model. The Many of our young people receive support for mental health, social and emotional health from their schools. And when the pandemic struck, not having those school-based resources and not really knowing how to access them in the community really, really had an impact on young people too. So I think it's important for us to make sure that we're providing ways and opportunities for young people to maintain those connections to the emotional support, to the social support, to the mental health support in other community spaces. Because if we ever have to experience something like the pandemic again, where we don't have that community hub, which is oftentimes the school, where else can we get those resources? And how can we make sure that there's continuity of experience for young people? It's also the relationships is also a part and parcel of the work that we did around social and emotional learning. We developed a set of social and emotional learning tools for equity that also really emphasizes the power and strength of relationship and relationship building as we're talking about development for not just young people, but for the adults who serve them. And so as we conclude today's session, I'd like to thank you all for attending, for participating, for engaging, for contributing. And especially I'd like to thank our panelists, Doctors Lenhoff and Singer and Reverend Simmons. So as always, today's session is being recorded. It will be added to the National Urban League's Education and Youth Development webinar series playlist on our YouTube page. And after today, once it's uploaded, I'll send an email out so that you all have the link for the playlist where you can watch this video and all of our prior or previous webinars in this series. Again, we will resume our series in September, and we welcome your input regarding pressing topics that you would love to see us cover in our next cycle. So,
May I say before we
Mhm.
go, don't hesitate to take care of each other in this work. It will burn you out. And you need to have a space where your emotional need can be met and supported as you work to do this. And the Urban League is a great way to do that because there is an Urban League connection. And I would just urge you all to be mindful and intent, and what's the word I'm looking for, with purpose. Seek those relationships and support each other as you do this work together.
excellent. Again, thank you all so much. Take care. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks.
You too.
Bye.
Thank you.